April 14th, 1941, 2:30 in the morning. Inside Sing Sing prison, 3 inmates lie in their hospital beds, waiting. They are not sick. They are waiting for a guard named John Hardy to walk past one more time. When he does, they attack. 2 shots hit him in the back. He falls. Outside, in the dark streets of Ossining, a young police officer named James Fagan drives past in his patrol car. He has no idea what is coming for him. In the next few minutes, 1 guard and 1 officer will be dead, and 1 inmate will be shot through the head. This is the story of 10 men who did not just break the rules inside Sing Sing. They broke the prison itself. Subscribe now, because it only gets darker from here. Joseph Whitey Reardon. Reardon, 26, and 2 other long-serving armed robbers, Charles McGale, 45, and John Patch Waters, 30, had spent months planning this. All 3 were serving 15-plus-year sentences for robbery, and all 3 had decided they weren't finishing them. They faked illness to get moved into the prison hospital on the 3rd floor, where the security was thinner and the guards worked mostly alone at night. Outside accomplices, including a man named Charles Bergstrom, had already smuggled in several revolvers, hidden in places nobody thought to check during a search. For months, the plan sat there waiting. 3 men lying in hospital beds every night, listening to a guard's footsteps and doing nothing but count. At 2:30 a.m., the 3 men made their move. When Officer Hardy passed Reardon's bed on his round, Reardon pulled a gun and shot him twice in the back. Hardy, 55 years old, dropped to the floor. A patient with a heart condition in the same ward saw the shooting and collapsed on the spot, dead of a heart attack before anyone could reach him. 2 killings in the same room in the same minute, and Sing Sing hadn't even gotten the men out the door yet. The trio forced their way through the hospital and out into the prison grounds, using a rope to lower themselves over a wall and down toward the village of Ossining. Not one alarm had sounded inside the prison the entire time. That's where Officer James Fagan found them. 35 years old, 7 years on the force, a wife and a 19-month-old son waiting for him at home, Fagan and his partner rolled up on routine patrol and called the men over to the car. Reardon answered with a shot through the windshield that lodged in Fagan's heart. Fagan's partner fired back and hit Waters through the head, killing him instantly. Reardon and McGale kept running into the dark. They did not get far. 6 hours later, police caught both men 3 miles from the prison. What happened next never made it into any official report, but it came out in court anyway. Reardon later testified that police interrogators beat a 63-page confession out of him. "We were handcuffed together, then they hit me," he told the court. His co-defendant, an outside accomplice named William Wade, claimed he had been struck more than 1,000 times during questioning. None of it changed the outcome. Reardon and McGale were convicted and sentenced to death. On June 11, 1942, they were executed in Sing Sing's death chamber, just yards from the hospital ward where they had shot Hardy 14 months earlier. The prison that failed to stop them from arming themselves inside its own walls became the place that killed them for it. Sing Sing's death chamber would see plenty more men walk through it in the years that followed. But 8 decades later, the danger inside those same walls would not come from inmates trying to escape. It would come from the very staff hired to keep order. Shamel Capers. On November 9th, 2022, a special unit of corrections officers called the Corrections Emergency Response Team, abbreviated CERT, arrived at Sing Sing for what was supposed to be a routine 2-day search of the facility, the kind of operation that happens at prisons across the state without incident. They came dressed head to toe in black tactical gear, faces covered by visors, moving cell block by cell block like a unit clearing a building. Rather than staff searching a housing area, they worked every day. What happened next wasn't a search. According to sworn statements later filed in court, officers ordered inmates to strip to their underwear, flip their mattresses, and then began hitting them. Fists, boots, batons. Men described being punched and kicked while handcuffed, pepper sprayed in enclosed cells, and slammed against walls and floors during a shakedown that stretched from November 7th to November 10th. Shamil Capers was one of the men caught inside it, just days from release when the CERT team came through his housing block. He described watching officers move cell to cell in matching black gear, methodically working their way down the tier while men screamed from inside their cells. Capers gave investigators a first-hand account of what he had witnessed once he walked out the gate, describing violence that lined up with hospital records and more than 24 sworn statements from other inmates who were still locked inside. He was not part of the eventual lawsuit himself, since he was already gone by the time it was filed, but his outside account became one of the pieces of evidence that helped corroborate the case against the department. By the time attorney Bruce Barkett filed suit on January 31st, 2023, on behalf of 26 inmates, the numbers were staggering. 7 prisoners sent straight to the hospital. More than 20 others were treated in the facility's medical unit. The lawsuit sought $1 million in damages for every man involved. This was nothing short of a planned attack on incarcerated men by correction officers, Barkett said. Worse, it was approved of and overseen by high-ranking officials in the prison. The FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York opened an investigation into the allegations. The State Department of Corrections declined to comment, citing the pending litigation. Capers had already walked out the front gate by the time the story broke. The men still inside were not so lucky, and one of them was about to give investigators an account almost identical to his. Anthony McNaughty. Anthony McNaughty was still incarcerated at Sing Sing when the CERT team's November 2022 search swept through his unit, and unlike Capers, he had nowhere to go once it was over. He remained locked inside the same facility as the officers he says assaulted him. McNaughty's account, filed as part of the 26-inmate lawsuit, described officers entering his cell, ordering him to strip down to his underwear, and striking him while he complied with every order given. He said he told officers he couldn't breathe as they tried to force his head into a property bag, and that the punches didn't stop once he said it. The lawsuit detailed similarly specific injuries from other inmates named in the suit: burns from being pressed against a radiator, a wrist twisted to the point of threatened fracture, and days of blindness after one man was pepper sprayed while already handcuffed on the ground. One prisoner said a female officer grabbed him and pushed his head toward a toilet bowl. What made McNaughty's account and the broader lawsuit so damaging wasn't just the violence, it was who was accused of allowing it. The suit alleged the attacks weren't the actions of a few officers losing control, but a coordinated operation that supervisors inside the prison knew about and let happen. New York State Department of Corrections and Community Supervision, the agency that runs Sing Sing, declined to comment on the specific allegations, citing the ongoing investigation. A spokesperson for the officers' union also declined to comment. For a facility with 200 years of history, the CERT search represented something particularly bleak. Sing Sing's own emergency response unit, the team meant to restore order during the worst incidents the prison could throw at it, had allegedly become the source of the worst incident on record for dozens of men in a single week. The institution wasn't failing to stop violence inside its walls anymore. In McNaughty's case and Capers's, prosecutors and investigators were being asked to consider whether Sing Sing had started producing that violence directly through the very unit built to contain it. Sing Sing's violence problem wasn't only physical. Sometimes it was organized well enough to answer to nobody but itself. We're only 3 cases into 10, and Sing Sing has already failed its own staff, its own inmates, and its own emergency response team. Subscribe now, because the next case shows this prison organizing crime from the inside, not just failing to stop it. Allah son Allah. On Christmas Eve, 1995, a 32-year-old inmate named Michael Jones was inside Sing Sing's walls, likely thinking about nothing more than getting through the holiday. Around 8 p.m., a fellow inmate walked up to him with a buck knife and stabbed him once in the chest. The blade punctured his heart. Jones bled to death inside a maximum security prison surrounded by guards, cameras, and a staff whose entire job was to prevent exactly this from happening on their watch. It took only seconds. There was no fight beforehand, no argument anyone could point to later. Just one man walking up to another with a weapon he had no business possessing inside a state prison. The killing wasn't random. Jones and his attacker were both members of the 5% Nation, also called the Nation of Gods and Earths, and the stabbing came out of an internal feud inside the group. According to prosecutors, the attack was carried out at the direction of another member, a man named Stephen Smith, who wanted the dispute settled with a blade instead of words. Sing Sing's investigation into Jones's death went nowhere. No arrest, no charges. The case sat cold for decades, while the man who killed him kept living his life on the outside after his release. It took the Westchester County District Attorney's Office almost 30 years to close it. Investigators reopened the file in 2019 and spent years tracking down witnesses who had been locked up at Sing Sing back in 1995, some of whom had scattered across multiple states by the time anyone came looking for them. In May of 2023, they finally made an arrest. The killer, who by then went by the name Allah Son Allah, 54 years old and living in Albany, was found guilty of manslaughter and sentenced to 20 years in state prison. District Attorney Miriam Roca credited the tenacity of the investigators and prosecutors for finally closing a case that Sing Sing itself had let go cold the moment it happened. 29 years passed between the stabbing and the sentence. A prison that can't stop a stabbing inside its own walls is one kind of failure. A prison that can't even solve the murder afterward, that lets a killer walk free for 3 decades while the file gathers dust, is a different, deeper one. And the man who gave the order for that killing was about to show that some of Sing Sing's worst violence wasn't spontaneous at all. It was organized, planned, and carried out on command. Stephen Smith wasn't the one holding the knife on Christmas Eve, 1995. He was the one who decided Jones needed to die. As a senior figure in the 5% Nation's internal structure inside Sing Sing, Smith held enough authority within the group that when he wanted a dispute resolved permanently, another member carried it out for him without question, on his word alone, inside a facility supposedly built to prevent exactly that kind of chain of command from forming. That's the part of this story that matters more than the stabbing itself. Sing Sing didn't just fail to stop a killing. Its population had organized itself into a functioning internal hierarchy, complete with leadership, discipline, and the authority to order a man's death. And the prison had no idea it was happening under its own roof. Nobody in a guard's uniform knew Smith's name carried that kind of weight until decades later, when prosecutors laid it out in a courtroom. Smith evaded any consequence for almost 30 years. He'd long since been released and was living an ordinary life in Salisbury, North Carolina, working, aging, apparently untouched by what he'd ordered done to Jones, when New York State Police finally caught up with him in May of 2023. The same investigation that led to his co-defendant's arrest. He was 60 years old by then. He pleaded guilty to second-degree manslaughter in April of 2024. Prosecutors were direct about what the case represented. This wasn't one man's snapping. It was a killing ordered through a chain of command that existed entirely inside Sing Sing's population, running parallel to the prison's own chain of command and answering to nobody in it. The institution built to contain criminal organization had instead given one man a room to organize it in and decades to walk away clean. Smith's sentencing closed the books on a killing from 1995, but it opened a bigger question that the Westchester District Attorney's Office never fully answered on the record. How many other disputes inside Sing Sing's population had been settled the same way, quietly, off the books, with nobody outside the prison ever finding out. Sing Sing's relationship with organized crime went back much further than 1995, though, and it didn't always take a knife to prove the prison couldn't hold what walked through its own gates. Monk Eastman. Long before Sing Sing became a maximum security fortress on paper, it was already failing to contain the men who ran New York's underworld, just not in the way people usually picture. In 1904, a gang leader named Edward Monk Eastman, head of the Eastman Gang, one of the most feared criminal organizations on the Lower East Side, was beaten unconscious by a policeman while committing a robbery. He was convicted and sentenced to 10 years at Sing Sing. On the street, Eastman's gang controlled entire blocks through extortion, protection rackets, and open warfare with rival crews, most notably the 5 Points gang across town. His arrest and removal should have been a clean win for law and order, the kind of story where the dangerous man goes away and the neighborhood gets safer. Instead, it created a vacuum, and vacuums in organized crime don't stay empty for long. With Eastman gone, control of the gang passed to his second-in-command, a man who went by Kid Twist. He did not hold the position long. In 1908, rival gang members from the 5 Points crew tracked him down and killed him, and without Eastman's authority to hold things together, the gang splintered into competing factions almost overnight. Men who had answered to one leader for years suddenly answered to nobody, and each faction wanted a piece of what Eastman had built. The resulting turf war spilled blood across Lower Manhattan for years afterward, the kind of chaotic, directionless violence Eastman himself had mostly kept contained under his own leadership, whatever else could be said about him. Sing Sing had done exactly what it was supposed to do on paper. It had removed a violent criminal from the street and locked him behind 200-year-old walls. What nobody accounted for was what happens to an organization when its leadership disappears overnight with no plan for what comes next. The prison had not just failed to stop crime, it had triggered a succession war it never saw coming, had no hand in controlling, and could not have predicted from inside its own gates. Eastman himself eventually served his time, got out, and later died a war hero after enlisting in World War I and fighting overseas. A strange final chapter for a man once called one of the most dangerous gang leaders in New York City. But the gang he built never recovered the shape it had before Sing Sing took its leader off the street. 3 decades later, the state would learn that same lesson again, this time with a much bigger name and a much bigger organization behind him. Charles "Lucky" Luciano. By 1936, Charles "Lucky" Luciano wasn't just a gangster. He was, by the FBI's own later description, the man who organized crime in America, the figure who built the modern commission after eliminating the men above him. Special Prosecutor Thomas Dewey spent years building a case against him, working through 36 witnesses, including prostitutes and madams from across the city, before finally landing a conviction on charges of running a citywide prostitution racket. In June of 1936, a judge sentenced Luciano to 30 to 50 years in prison, the longest sentence ever handed down in New York for that particular crime. The state sent him to Sing Sing. He didn't stay long. Within weeks, New York corrections officials pulled Luciano out of Sing Sing and transferred him nearly 300 miles north to Clinton Prison in Dannemora, a maximum security facility so remote and so isolated it was nicknamed Little Siberia by the men who served time there. Officials believed that was the only place equipped to truly cut Luciano off from the criminal network he still commanded, even from behind bars. Think about what that decision actually says out loud. This wasn't a routine transfer between two similar facilities. It was the state of New York looking at its own oldest, most storied maximum security prison, the one with 110 years of history by that point, and deciding it wasn't secure enough to hold one man's influence over a citywide crime syndicate. Sing Sing had walls, guards, and every bit of institutional weight New York State could throw behind it, and none of that was enough to convince officials it could actually stop Luciano from running his empire from inside its cells. They weren't wrong to worry. Even after the transfer, Luciano kept directing the commission's operations through his ally Frank Costello, who ran day-to-day business on the outside, while Luciano served his sentence hundreds of miles away. By 1938, when Luciano's final appeals had failed, Costello had formally taken over as head of the operation Luciano built, with barely a hiccup in how the organization functioned. The prison system had contained the man's body. It had never come close to containing his reach, and everyone who mattered in New York's underworld knew it. Sing Sing's brush with the most powerful organized crime figure in American history lasted only a matter of weeks before the state moved him somewhere it trusted more than its own oldest prison. Decades later, Sing Sing wouldn't have the luxury of transferring its problems away to a facility better equipped to handle them. It would have to live with what was happening inside its own walls, day after day, with no Dannemora to ship it off to. Speaking of problems the state couldn't transfer away, subscribe now if you want to see exactly how bad it got when Sing Sing ran out of guards to watch its own inmates. Anthony Douglas. By February of 2025, Sing Sing was dealing with a crisis that had nothing to do with any single inmate. Correction officers across more than 24 New York State facilities had launched an illegal wildcat strike on February 17th, walking off the job to protest conditions and staffing levels. The state activated roughly 6,500 National Guard members just to keep basic prison operations running with a fraction of the trained staff the facilities were built around. Inmates across the state were locked down around the clock, cut off from visits, educational programs, and in some cases adequate medical attention for days at a stretch. Anthony Douglas, 67, had been locked up for nearly 40 years, convicted decades earlier of murder in Brooklyn. On February 26, 2025, 10 days into the strike, Douglas was found dead inside his cell at Sing Sing at 4:25 in the afternoon, according to a department spokesperson. He had spent the previous 10 days in lockdown along with everyone else on his unit, with the reduced staffing limiting how closely anyone was actually checking on the men inside their cells. A Department of Corrections spokesperson, Thomas Maley, confirmed the death, but offered little explanation for what had happened in the hours before it was discovered. Advocates for incarcerated people pointed to the obvious problem. When a facility strips down to skeleton staffing during an unauthorized strike, the men locked inside stop getting the level of monitoring that might catch a medical emergency in time to do anything about it. Douglas was one of at least 3 prisoners who died statewide in the span of a single week during the walkout, in a system that was supposed to have eyes on every man inside it, every hour of every day. Douglas wasn't the only man who died at Sing Sing that day. Franklin Dominguez. Franklin Dominguez, 35, had been at Sing Sing since July of 2022 on an assault conviction out of Manhattan. He was not serving a life sentence like Douglas. He was not a name anyone outside the prison would have recognized before that week. He was one of thousands of men caught inside a system that had, for the moment, simply stopped functioning the way it was designed to. On February 26, 2025, roughly 4 hours after Anthony Douglas was found dead in his cell, Dominguez died too, inside the same building, under the same lockdown, watched over by the same reduced staff. 2 deaths, same facility, same afternoon, both during a strike-driven lockdown that had already cut inmates off from visits, educational programs, and counseling services for more than a week straight, with National Guard members standing in for trained corrections staff in hallways they had never worked before. Criminal justice reform advocates didn't hold back. The officers claimed to be complaining about safety, said Jerome Wright, co-director of the Halt Solitary campaign. They are not dying, we are. So whose safety is really a concern here? It was a blunt way of putting it, but the math was hard to argue with. 2 inmates were dead in one afternoon at a single facility running on emergency staffing, while the strike that caused the staffing shortage in the first place continued outside the walls without any end in sight. Sing Sing wasn't built to run on a skeleton crew, and when it did, the men locked inside paid for it first, with no warning and no way to ask for help that anyone would actually hear. The prison's failure to protect Douglas and Dominguez wasn't the result of any one guard's mistake or any one bad shift. It was what happens when an entire institution stops functioning at once, all at the same time, with nobody left to catch what falls through the cracks. Jose Estevez Luciano. Not every failure inside Sing Sing came from an inmate. Sometimes the institution's compromise ran straight through its own payroll. Jose Estevez Luciano had worked as a corrections officer at Sing Sing since 2015, sworn in like every other guard to protect the people inside the walls and keep contraband out of them. Starting in October of 2021, he began running a smuggling operation that would continue for nearly 2 full years without anyone catching on. Working with an outside accomplice named Francis de la Cruz, then 24 years old, Estevez Luciano arranged for cell phones and other contraband to be delivered into the prison in exchange for cash payments from inmates' families and associates on the outside, turning his own badge into a delivery service. The scheme was not small, and it was not sloppy. Court records show de la Cruz would collect the money and the phones from associates of the incarcerated men, then hand everything off to Estevez Luciano, who carried it past Sing Sing's own security checkpoints and delivered it directly to incarcerated people inside the facility he was sworn to protect. One single payment, prosecutors said, came to more than $5,000. Text messages between the 2 men, later entered as evidence, showed them actively coordinating to avoid detection, discussing which days were safer to move product and which days to hold off. At one point, Estevez Luciano warned his partner not to send screenshots of their communications because they are investigating and checking all phones. The scheme ran for nearly 2 years before Westchester County investigators caught up with it. In November of 2023, both men were indicted. District Attorney Miriam Roca didn't mince words about what the case represented. A correction officer allegedly violated his oath and duty by working with someone outside the facility to create a potentially dangerous environment for the incarcerated population and his fellow officers, she said. Estevez Luciano pleaded guilty in November of 2024 to conspiracy, bribery, contraband, and official misconduct charges. In February of 2025, a judge sentenced him to 1 to 3 years in state prison. District Attorney Susan Cacase, who by then had taken over the office, put it plainly: scheming to undermine these safeguards, all for personal enrichment, makes our prisons less safe and erodes public trust in government. Sing Sing's inmates had spent nearly 2 centuries finding ways to beat the institution from the inside. Reardon needed smuggled guns. Eastman needed a second-in-command. Luciano needed a phone call to Frank Costello. Estevez Luciano didn't need any of that. He was already inside the institution, wearing the uniform that was supposed to stop exactly this kind of scheme before it started. The system wasn't just failing to prevent contraband from entering the prison anymore. In his case, it was the one delivering it, one bribe at a time for nearly 2 years. If you want to see what happens when a state finally gets tired of covering for its own prison system, stick around for the ending and subscribe so you do not miss the next one. None of this stayed contained to Sing Sing's own case files. In October of 2024, after a lawsuit from the New York Civil Liberties Union that had dragged through the courts since 2023, the state's Department of Corrections and Community Supervision agreed to release 2 decades of misconduct and disciplinary records covering all 44 state prisons and 16,700 corrections officers, records the department had fought for years in court to keep sealed from public view. It was a wholesale accounting of just how much staff misconduct across New York's entire prison system had gone undisclosed for 2 decades. Name by name, incident by incident, forced into daylight only after the state lost the fight to keep it hidden. 10 men, 1 prison, 200 years, and in the end, it took a lawsuit to make any of it public at all. Thanks for watching.